Okay, so we're back and we're talking about, this is part 2 video of the CAP worksheet, OASIS worksheet video. We're looking at the clinical bottom line. So you'll find the clinical bottom line is at the very beginning of the article, and the clinical bottom line is an important piece. It's right at the beginning because they want us to be able to just pull these caps and be able to read real quickly a summary of what this, process means for us. A few things that I use just thinking about the clinical bottom line is, and this is actually the one that I do last, even though it's right at the beginning of the article, or of the worksheet. So you want to think about, after I've read all of this study, what are the implications for these 3 areas: clinic, research, and education? So think to yourself, okay, now that I've read this, what does it mean that practitioners should do in a clinic or should not do in a clinic? What does it tell us about how we're going to use it? What kind of equipment we're going to need to purchase? What kind of strategies we're going to need to implement? What kind of interdisciplinary work do we need to do? Just anything related to the practice setting. You might talk about how this would be really good in a rehab, but it's not really going to work in a school system for these reasons. Excuse me, anything about the implications for practice. Then we would talk about the implications for education. So this is a new thing that practitioners wouldn't really be familiar with. This is not part of the education standards currently. It's not entry-level practice for brand new clinicians. Mostly it'll be experienced people that would do this, or these are things we should add into our educational programs because this study, the results are so significant and so important that maybe we need to think about putting them in our education standards. It could be, you could say something like clinicians could go to a quick workshop. If you know there is a workshop, you could investigate that a little bit. Is there a workshop? Continuing education teaching me how to do this thing. Clinicians could go to that weekend workshop and then have enough information to be able to use it in their clinic. So think about educational ways that we would use it. And then you want to think about research. So if you look in the clinical bottom line information, it tells you, think about the type of study design. Think about the level of evidence. So if you say, well, this study design wasn't randomized, so we could repeat this research, we could randomize or we could get bigger sample sizes. We need to take this certain bias out. We should look further at adding some other interventions. A lot of the information you're going to get about the research stuff is what the authors probably have already said in their discussion as well, as far as here's what we need to do. Here's some ways that we could increase the validity of this article, the internal validity. So those Pedro scores, how could we get those up if we did blinding next time, if it's possible, if we did statistics instead of a qualitative study, those kind of things. The clinical bottom line is just a summary, essentially, and so a lot of that information you're going to get out of the conclusion of your article. So I do that one last, so I have a really clear picture of where what it's trying to tell me. And if you're not sure, a really great thing to do might be to just look on the evidence exchange and read a few of these so you get an idea of what kind of things they wanted in that bottom line. The research objective is really just what were they trying to accomplish with that research. What usually it's kind of stated in that, and sometimes you'll find that in your abstract, but a lot of times they just outwardly say it. An important thing in this worksheet is that if it is not clearly stated in the worksheet, you have to put it as not reported, so NR. So the first time you write not reported, you're going to put not reported in words, you're going to put NR in parentheses, and then from then on you can use NR, and that way we'll know that it wasn't reported. But make sure that in the research objectives and the clinical bottom line and all those, that you're not copying it word for word. You need to paraphrase that article and put it in your own words. The design type and the level of evidence. The guidelines have some good instructions for you about reading that. and just try to figure that out. What I was telling somebody the other day was, when you're looking at design type, try to think about how many groups were there. Think about whether those groups were randomized. Kind of teasing that information out will help you kind of figure out what the design type is and what level of evidence it is. But I'm glad to help you if you need help with that, but hopefully it's clearly stated. Not always, as we know. How were the participants recruited and selected to participate? So that's, again, just your own information, your own ideas based on what it said in the article. You're putting it into your own words. The inclusion criteria are, what were the things that makes me want to include somebody in this study. Exclusion criteria as a whole is always the opposite of, so if the inclusion criteria is everybody has to speak English, then the opposite, the exclusion criteria, is obviously anybody who doesn't speak English. So you can do opposites of what the inclusion criteria were, or they may specifically say something that excludes people, like you can't live in Southwest Missouri to be in this study. So you want to look, did they specifically say what the exclusion criteria is? But you, with evidence, you can say the opposite. If they want all English-speaking people, then anybody not English-speaking is an exclusion for you. Okay, so participant characteristics. Remember that N equals just the number of participants, and then we're going back up to the top here. Okay, so make sure that you pay attention to this part right here. Sometimes this gets confusing. It asks for the number and the percent that's male. Okay, so you have 15 males, 15 females, or whatever. So if you had 30 people total, you would put 15 divided by 30, and then that would be your percentage. So the number of males over the total number of people, or divided by the total number of people. So make sure you have both of those things in that blank. All right, their ethnicity, if it's listed. If it's not listed, don't make assumptions. Unless you have some evidence in the article that tells you that's what an answer is, don't ever make an assumption. But if the evidence is there and you can make an educated assumption based on the, not an assumption, you can make an educated statement based on the evidence, then you can put it in there. If there is a disease or a disability diagnosis, make sure you put that in there. Those are pretty easy. All right, in the next section, we start talking about interventions and the control groups. So if there were two groups, for instance, group 1, group 2, in that case, I'm not going to use all the rest of the boxes for group 3 or group 4. Even if it's listed, I'm not going to use those. But if there was a group 1 and the description of the intervention was it's a control group and they didn't receive an intervention, then that's what you put in the brief description. A key to these intervention and control groups is you're only going to use the interventions in this assignment that relate to your clinical question. So I believe up here, let's see, they used to, and I don't see that on here. One of the things I want you to include in your assignment, whether it's just in the written part of your Blackboard, they used to have a place on here where you could type in your clinical question. So let's make a deal here that we will do the clinical question in the clinical bottom line box. Okay, just put a statement in there. This was the clinical question was, how effective are time management and stress management interventions to OTA students? Let's put that in the clinical bottom line box. That way I know and I can determine whether your interventions relate to that. And that'll help you also stay a little focused. You can add groups in if you have more than 3 groups or 3 interventions. You don't want to, this says group 1, but it also means intervention 1. So if you have a control group, I'd answer that for group 1. Group 2 might have had multiple interventions. So instead of, we might say group 2, and then we might describe all the intervention, one of the interventions. You might need to go down here where it talks about group 3, and you may need to change this to intervention 2. Okay. So group 2, intervention 2, because this is the first intervention up here. Okay. Right. And then we go to intervention. So we go to our second intervention down here. Maybe this is the control group. And so what I can do is I can take these out and I can say control group, and then I can say experimental group. Right. And so this is intervention 1. And then we could say experimental intervention 2. So you can do something like that. You need as many boxes or many sets of boxes as you have interventions. So if you have multiple interventions, you need to put them here, but they need to relate to your clinical question. So for instance, if I were doing, I probably wouldn't be doing this research, but if I was doing research on, well, let's make it OT related. So how music affects range of motion, which there are some studies about that. So, but say one of the articles has as their intervention something about feeding for some reason, right? I care about all the information or the interventions they did related to music, but I don't care about that intervention related to feeding, because it might have worked in their research, but it doesn't relate at all to my subject. So I'm not going to talk about that one. I'm only going to talk about the stuff that applies to my clinical question. So that will help you in not feeling like you have to write every single, maybe they have 10 interventions. You don't have to write all of them unless they apply to your clinical question. All right, we're at 12 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead, and when we come back, we're going to talk about intervention bias. So stay tuned.